Carl Jung said, "Every form of addiction is bad, no matter whether the narcotic be alcohol or morphine or idealism." But he didn't see intelligent people who struggle with addiction as weak. He saw them as exiled from themselves. The sharper your mind, the deeper your shadow, and if you don't give your soul meaning, your mind will find something to numb itself with. You'd think intelligence would be protective, that the sharper the mind, the further it could see past its own traps. But Carl Jung noticed something that unsettled that assumption entirely. Sometimes the smarter the mind, the more elaborate the trap it builds for itself. This is the part almost nobody expects. The people who analyze everything, who see patterns others miss, who can predict consequences 3 steps ahead, are often the same people who end up trapped in behaviors they can articulate perfectly and still can't stop. Not because they lack insight, because insight was never the missing ingredient. Most people assume addiction is a failure of understanding. Explain the risks clearly enough, and a rational person will simply choose differently. But intelligent people often understand the risks better than anyone in the room, sometimes long before the behavior even becomes a problem, and the understanding changes almost nothing. They can diagram their own dysfunction with startling precision and still return to it the next night. This contradiction is exactly where Jung's work becomes useful, because it explains what pure logic can't. Jung believed the conscious mind, however sharp, is only a small visible portion of who a person actually is. Beneath it sits something vast that doesn't operate on reasoning at all. It operates on unmet need, on unresolved feeling, on old patterns seeking discharge. Intelligence lives almost entirely in that small, visible portion. It's an extraordinary tool for analysis, but analysis was never built to regulate what happens underneath it. A brilliant mind trying to outthink an unconscious wound is like a skilled negotiator arguing with weather. Impressive technique, wrong target entirely. This is why willpower and insight, the 2 tools intelligent people rely on most, are frequently the least effective tools against addiction. They were designed for a different kind of problem. And here is the sentence worth holding onto for the rest of this, because it will keep proving itself true. Understanding a pattern and being free of it are 2 entirely different achievements, and intelligence only ever guarantees the first one. Here's where it gets more specific. Intelligent people often develop addiction, not despite their minds, but because of how their minds work. A sharp, fast, associative mind rarely rests. It notices everything, connects everything, replays everything. That kind of mind can be a gift and a relentless machine at the same time, one that doesn't have an obvious off switch. For many highly intelligent people, substances or compulsive behaviors become, quietly, the only reliable way they've ever found to turn the volume down, not to escape reality exactly, to escape the sheer processing load of their own awareness. Jung would call this a compensatory pattern. The psyche is always trying to balance itself, and when the conscious mind runs at an intensity the rest of the system can't sustain, something eventually reaches for relief. If that relief isn't found consciously, through rest, through connection, through meaning, the unconscious will find it unconsciously, and it will find it in whatever channel is available and effective. For many bright, overactive minds, substances offer exactly that. Fast, dependable, chemical silence. There's a second layer that makes intelligent people especially vulnerable, and it's less discussed. Intelligence is excellent at building justifications. A person who can construct an argument for anything can construct an argument for their own addiction too, often a genuinely persuasive one. I'm using it to think more clearly. I'm using it to unwind after carrying more than most people carry. I have this under control, unlike people who actually have a problem. These aren't lies, exactly. They're intelligence doing what intelligence does, reasoning skillfully in service of something the reasoning was never meant to protect. This is why intelligent people are often the hardest people to convince they have a problem. Not because the evidence is unclear to them, because they can out-argue the evidence faster than almost anyone around them, including themselves. Watch how this shows up. The high-functioning professional who never misses a deadline, whose work is meticulous, whose drinking nobody would call a problem because the performance never visibly cracks. The brilliant, self-aware person in therapy who can explain the psychological mechanism behind their compulsion in exact clinical language and still act it out that same week. The person who reads every book on the subject, understands the neuroscience, understands the childhood roots, understands the pattern completely, and still can't seem to stop. Understanding the mechanism and being freed from the mechanism are two entirely different processes, and intelligent people often mistake the first for the second, because understanding has worked for them everywhere else in life. That's the trap specifically. In almost every other domain, understanding something well enough eventually gives you control over it. Addiction doesn't obey that rule, because addiction isn't fundamentally a knowledge problem. It's an unmet emotional need wearing a very convincing intellectual disguise. You can watch this pattern take different shapes depending on the profession, and the shapes are worth naming because they rarely look like what people picture when they hear the word addiction. The surgeon who is precise and composed in the operating room and can't sit through a single evening without a drink because stillness, for that particular nervous system, feels more dangerous than exhaustion. The writer who can only produce work in the grip of a substance, convinced, with real conviction, that the chemical is the source of the creativity rather than a costume it eventually started wearing. The founder who built an entire company on relentless work, praised publicly for a discipline that privately functions as the exact same avoidance mechanism as any other addiction, just wearing a suit instead of a bottle. Achievement itself can become the substance. Nobody stages an intervention for someone addicted to accomplishment because the culture rewards that particular compulsion instead of naming it. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it expands what addiction actually means beyond the narrow picture most people carry. Anything that reliably numbs an unbearable internal state and that the mind can rationalize as productive, admirable, or at least harmless, qualifies. Substances are simply the most visible version. Overworking, constant intellectual stimulation, compulsive information consumption, even relentless self-improvement can all serve the identical unconscious function. Silencing a feeling the intellect was never given permission to sit with directly. Jung spoke about what he called the shadow, the parts of ourselves we've pushed out of conscious awareness because they felt unacceptable, dangerous, or incompatible with who we needed to appear to be. For many intelligent people, especially those praised early for their minds, an entire emotional world gets quietly relegated to the shadow, vulnerability, need. Simple, wordless comfort that doesn't require being clever to receive. Being smart becomes the identity. Being fragile becomes the thing that identity was built to hide. And a mind that has spent years being rewarded for competence rarely knows what to do with an emotional need it can't think its way through. Addiction, in this light, often isn't reaching for pleasure at all. It's reaching for the one thing the intellect was never allowed to ask for directly, relief from having to be capable for a while. This is uncomfortable to sit with because it reframes the entire behavior, not weakness, not moral failure, a workaround, clumsy and dangerous, for a need that never had a legitimate outlet. The brilliant mind built an elaborate detour because the direct road, simply admitting I need comfort, I need rest, I need to not perform right now, was closed off a long time ago, usually by an environment that only rewarded the performance and rarely acknowledged the person underneath it. Think about where that closure usually begins. A child praised primarily for achievement learns quickly what earns attention and what doesn't. Being smart got noticed. Being upset got managed, dismissed, or quietly discouraged. Over time, a durable equation forms. My mind is valuable, my feelings are inconvenient. That equation doesn't disappear in adulthood just because the child grew up and became successful by every external measure. It becomes the operating system, running underneath decades of accomplishment, waiting for the moment the mind finally gets tired enough to stop overriding it. That moment often arrives disguised as burnout, or restlessness, or a compulsion that seems to come out of nowhere in someone who otherwise has everything under control. It isn't out of nowhere. It's decades of unmet need, finally loud enough to override even a formidable intellect. There's a specific kind of isolation that follows intelligent people into this pattern, and it deserves its own attention. Because they can articulate their struggles so precisely, they often get treated by everyone around them, friends, partners, sometimes even therapists, as though understanding the problem clearly means they're already most of the way towards solving it. Nobody worries as urgently about the person who can explain their own dysfunction with such fluency. That fluency becomes a strange kind of camouflage, one the person themselves often doesn't realize they're wearing, and it means help, when it does arrive, often arrives late. after the private cost has already grown far larger than anyone watching from the outside could see. Jung believed that whatever remains unconscious doesn't simply fade. It accumulates, and it eventually finds a way to express itself, usually in a form the conscious mind finds easier to tolerate than the original feeling. For intelligent people, addiction can become exactly that kind of expression, a symptom that's easier to manage, analyze, and rationalize than the raw feeling underneath it. It's often easier to be a person who drinks too much than a person who admits they've felt fundamentally unseen since childhood. One of those identities can be discussed clinically at a dinner party. The other one requires actual vulnerability. This is also why recovery approaches, built purely on information, tend to underperform with highly intelligent people. More facts about the risks, more data about the mechanism, more explanation of the neuroscience, all of it gets absorbed and understood, and none of it touches the actual driver. The mind was never confused about the danger. It was using the behavior to solve a problem the mind itself doesn't have access to, an old emotional deficit sitting far below where analysis can reach. Understanding a pattern and being free of it are two entirely different achievements. Intelligence keeps handing over the first one and calling it the second. What actually shifts something is different, and it tends to be far less comfortable than gathering more knowledge. It requires the intelligent mind to do something it has often spent an entire life avoiding, stepping aside and letting a much less articulate part of the self finally be heard, not analyzed, heard. The part that's simply exhausted from performing competence. The part that never got permission to need anything without earning it first. The part that has been trying, through the addiction, to say something the intellect never learned how to translate honestly. Jung called the work of integrating these disowned parts individuation, becoming whole not by defeating the unwanted parts of yourself, but by finally making room for them. For intelligent people, specifically, this often means learning to trust something other than thinking, sensation, feeling. The wordless signals a brilliant mind has spent years overriding because they didn't arrive with sufficient evidence attached. This is deeply unfamiliar territory for someone whose entire sense of competence was built on reasoning things through, and that unfamiliarity is precisely why it tends to get avoided the longest. There's a particular kind of loneliness carried by intelligent people struggling with addiction that rarely gets discussed. Everyone assumes they should be able to think their way out, including the person themselves, and the repeated failure to do so becomes its own private shame, layered on top of whatever the original wound was. Why can't I solve this? I can solve everything else. That question, asked with real cruelty toward the self, often makes the shadow heavier rather than lighter, because it adds a second unbearable feeling, failure. On top of the first one, the addiction was already trying to numb. This is why compassion, not more analysis, tends to be the actual turning point. Not compassion as a soft platitude, but as a genuine reordering of the relationship between the intellect and the rest of the psyche. The mind stops being asked to solve what was never a thinking problem, and starts being asked instead to simply witness what's actually there, without immediately trying to fix, explain, or outperform it. This is a strange kind of surrender for a mind built on solving things, and it rarely happens in one decisive moment. It tends to happen in small, repeated instances of choosing to feel something instead of narrating it, long before it becomes a stable new habit of relating to oneself. Jung wrote that until the unconscious becomes conscious, it directs a person's life, and that person calls it fate. For many intelligent people caught in addictive patterns, the felt experience matches that description precisely. It feels like fate, like something outside their control, despite an obviously capable mind, because in a real sense, it is outside the jurisdiction that mind was ever equipped to govern. The path forward isn't a smarter argument. It's finally letting a different part of the self into the room, one the intellect spent years keeping outside the door for good, understandable reasons that no longer serve who that person actually is now. There's a quiet shift that tends to happen somewhere in this process, and it doesn't usually look dramatic from the outside. It's the moment someone stops narrating their own struggle so cleverly and simply admits, without a polished explanation attached, that they're tired, that they're scared, that they don't fully understand why they keep returning to the same behavior despite knowing better. That admission feels, to a mind trained on competence, like failure. Jung would say it's closer to the opposite. It's the first honest data the psyche has received in a very long time. And honest data, unlike clever justification, is the only kind that actually changes anything. If any part of this described a pattern you recognize in yourself or someone you love, that recognition is worth taking seriously rather than reasoning around. There's more waiting for you inside inward, because understanding the mind clearly enough to finally hear what it's actually been asking for is where real change begins.